My name is Tracy Moniz, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Communication Studies at Mount St. Vincent University in Nova Scotia, Canada. The research I'm presenting was part of my doctoral work, which explored representations of women's labor in Canadian newspapers during the Second World War. To begin, I'll share some historical background. On September the 10th, 1939, Canada entered the Second World War. Men enlisted and traveled overseas on active duty. This left major labor shortages on the home front, and by 1942, this led the Canadian government to call on the nation's woman power, as then Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King called it. What followed was the massive mobilization of women's traditional labor, meaning domestic and volunteer work, as well as the recruitment of women into the paid workforce. Single women first, then married women, and eventually married women with children. By 1944, a woman filled 1 out of every 3 jobs. The Second World War created the social and political economic conditions for women to extend their labor beyond the private sphere of the home and into the public sphere workforce. This blurred and challenged traditional patriarchal divisions of labor. As mentioned, for women, joining the war effort meant increased domestic responsibilities, volunteering, enlisting, and joining the civilian workforce. Women's domestic labor was mobilized on the largest and most strategic scale. During the war, thrift and economy were especially important. Homemakers assisted the war effort by rationing, preventing waste, and saving and collecting materials that could be recycled for use in war production. Women also grew, quote, victory gardens, bought victory bonds, and managed family budgets and did the purchasing for the household. Much like domestic work, the federal government relied heavily on women's volunteerism, so much so that it established the Women's Voluntary Services Division within the Department of National War Services to coordinate the voluntary efforts of millions of Canadian women. Volunteers engaged in activities across various fields of work, including hospital, housing and boarding, and childcare services. Volunteers also made clothing, worked in canteens, organized letter-writing campaigns for the armed forces, led training in first aid, and distributed information to households on rationing. Women's participation in the paid workforce was crucial to Canada's involvement in the war. Under the direction of the National Selective Service, women enlisted and flooded the labor market, many for the first time, and many in jobs formerly performed by men. When the war started, about 600,000 women held paid work in Canada. By November 1943, the number of women working full-time doubled to 1.2 million, with 260,000 of these women employed in war industry. In the end, 600,000 women who did not work before the war joined the full-time workforce. And since only about 85,000 of these women were unemployed and looking for work just before the war began, this means that over 500,000 new female workers entered the workforce, and another 800,000 worked part-time or on farms. So I wanted to understand how newspapers negotiated the changing demands imposed on women by the nation's, quote, total war effort, unquote. So I asked the following research questions. To what extent did Canadian newspapers cover the subject of women's labor, domestic, volunteer, and wage, with an emphasis on wage work? And with respect to the construction of gender roles in news of women's wartime labor, I wanted to know how the coverage of women's wage labor in the female-dominated women's pages compared to coverage in the male-dominated general news and editorials of the commercial press. And I also wanted to know how coverage of women's wage labor in the commercial press compared to coverage in the alternative labor press. Research that addresses how newspapers represented women's labor in Canada during the Second World War is limited, and there is no systematic longitudinal analysis. This reflects a methodological gap in the literature, and it also raises doubts as to whether existing research sufficiently captures a comprehensive Canadian perspective on the social construction of gender in news of women's wartime labor, using newspapers as an object of analysis. In response to these gaps, I conducted a comparative content analysis of commercial and alternative labor newspapers in Canada. I analyzed 3 commercial newspapers and 3 independent labor newspapers, a pair in each of 3 major Canadian cities: Toronto, Ontario, Hamilton, Ontario, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, all major urban centers during the war employing the greatest numbers of women. The stratified random sample consisted of 342 newspaper issues published during the 6 war years, 216 issues of the commercial press, and 126 issues of the labor press. Within each issue, I sampled the general news pages, the women's pages, and editorials. The content analysis coded for categories such as the type of labor, placement of coverage, topic of coverage, and discursive framing. To analyze the results, I applied a feminist media studies theoretical lens, which considers the media's role in representing gender and transmitting stereotypical and patriarchal values about women. In this view, both the production and content of media are gendered. Feminist media theory helps explain how gender relations shape journalistic practices and institutions, and how gender discourses are encoded in media texts. With respect to my first research question, to what extent did Canadian newspapers cover the subject of women's labor, I found minimal newspaper coverage on the subject. The search yielded only 263 individual news items, 190 hits in the commercial press, and 73 in the labor press. Women's wartime labor was not a priority on the overall news agenda. Furthermore, while women's unpaid traditional labor was mobilized on the greatest scale during the Second World War, in the news it was women's wage labor that received the greatest proportion of coverage. This reflects in part its newsworthiness, but it also reflects the perceived lack of newsworthiness of women's traditional work, which, as unpaid work, was not really viewed as labor at all, at least not in an economic sense. Here, I wanted to know whether the invisibility and marginalization of women in mainstream news and editorial coverage, as argued by feminist media theory, whether it persisted in the women's pages, given that some feminist studies claim that the women's pages provided a space for discussing women's achievements and a chronicle of women's advancing status in society. If anywhere, the women's pages, as news written for women and by women, held the greatest potential to tell the story of women's experience as paid laborers in wartime, and through a female lens. But the content analysis demonstrated that general news housed the greater proportion of coverage on women's wage labor, and the women's pages contained the greater proportion of coverage on women's domestic and volunteer work. Qualitatively, then, this means that men generated the greatest proportion of coverage on women's wage labor in the commercial press, and that women were comparatively less involved in drafting the history of their own labor. Although women headed the women's sections, men still controlled the newspaper and influenced coverage, and this patriarchal structure of news journalism reinforced patriarchal messages about women's labor, including mixed messages of critique and praise of women's performance on the job. On the one side, coverage criticized women's workplace behavior, such as their absenteeism or neglect on the job, and offered advice to increase productivity. For example, in a column published in the Toronto Daily Star in 1943, the columnist, a male, scolded women's frivolous and emotional behavior as being detrimental to workplace morale and productivity, and ultimately detrimental to the war effort. This communicates the idea that the workplace was not women's natural sphere in the same way it was men's. At the same time, coverage in the women's pages also highlighted women's workplace strengths, but interestingly, coverage often negotiated these strengths in terms of qualities associated with women's gendered roles, such as caregiving and servitude. For example, on April 27, 1943, the women's pages of the Toronto Daily Star presented images of Russian, Indian, and American women working in logging and in railroad yards, as well as manufacturing war goods. The article celebrated these women as exceeding productivity expectations at, quote, jobs their men would be doing in peacetime, unquote. One of the photos depicted 4 working mothers, noting that combined these women have 42 children, including grandchildren. The article serves to remind readers that women were wives and mothers first. And so the content analysis revealed patterns that raised doubts about the women's pages as a space that enabled more progressive identities to unfold. And this type of progressive coverage was even less likely to occur in the male-dominated general news and editorials, which housed the greater percentage of coverage on women's non-traditional wage labor, and like the women's pages, upheld a dominant patriarchal social order that defined and addressed women in terms of the private domestic sphere. With respect to my final research question, here I wanted to know whether the invisibility and marginalization of women in mainstream news media, as argued by feminist media theory, whether it persisted in the commercial news coverage of the Second World War, and even more so, whether it persisted in alternative news media, which in theory are more likely to portray women in less conventional ways that challenge a patriarchal social order. The content analysis, however, revealed that this was not the case. Both the commercial and the labor press framed women's wage labor foremost in ways that foregrounded gender in the description of female laborers. For example, both newspaper types often included an indication of sex and/or gender in describing working women. This includes examples such as, quote, women workers, women wage earners, and women bomber and fighter pilots, unquote. Interestingly, sex and/or gender were not specified as qualifiers in descriptions of male labor. The labor force was male domain, and both the mainstream and alternative news media associated labor with male by default. News discourse reminded readers that women were still always doing men's jobs, and that they were, quote, wartime additions to the workforce, unquote, who worked solely to release men for other duties as a way to, quote, hurdle the manpower problem, unquote, and, quote, answer the Dominion government's call for maximum production, unquote. Framing women's labor as temporary marginalized their presence in the workforce, and the social construction of separate spheres for men and women, where men were wage earners and women were not, went largely unchallenged in and by news media. And so the alternative press turned out to be not quite so alternative after all in its coverage of women's wage labor. In my presentation today, I've strived to demonstrate the significance of gender for understanding how news media covered the subject of women's wartime labor. In the process, I hope to offer a way of thinking about women's history, and more specifically, the historical relationship between news media and women that, 1, is inclusive of traditional and non-traditional forms of labor, 2, that extends beyond traditional and historical gendered divisions of labor, and 3, that fosters an understanding of women's wage labor as provoking these historical public-private divisions precisely because it held so much potential to challenge them. Thank you for your kind attention.